Right. So the project is finding stories about how people are using generative AI to change the way they work, how they're incorporating it into work. And each week we kind of find a different industry or a different way that people use it. And we kind of find different stories. What are we looking at this week? What are we jumping into?
They were looking at less of an industry like we've done in the past with things like education or healthcare, and more at a specific task that so many people have to deal with. We're looking at debugging. Now, this is something that ChatGPT has been known to be doing for a long time. This is necessarily revolutionary. Oh, this is the kind of stuff we've been seeing as soon as this started coming out. Find the error in the script, basic stuff. Here you go. This is all well and good. You can kind of plug through a handful of different examples and easily get almost immediate feedback on what the problem is. But all these have been pretty much test cases for a long time. And once you start getting into bigger projects, finding a single error is less an issue because they're usually everywhere, but it's also finding out how they work into everything else. And well, GPT is really, you start putting things in, you ask it, debug this code, and it'll maybe show you some error along the way, but that's not really what you're looking for. I want the call stack. I want the outputs. I want the local variable at this moment. The process is something that when you try to start asking ChatGPT for, you come up against these, as a predictive language model, I am not capable of running projects and things like that. It's not a computer. Python program, generate a random number, nothing uncommon. He gets back some pretty simple code. And as always, I'm trying to replicate these workflows that people are coming up with and so I tried the same thing, put the exact same prompt in, and what I got is, you can see, significantly similar. This is something that I come up against doing a lot of this research is people post their outputs without posting the full prompts or prompt chains that they've gone through to get that, because I've played around enough with this, this prompt that he gave, asked for a very simple random number generator. There's almost no way that he got all of this. It's going between numbers of 1 and 5, or between 0 and 1, looking for if it's greater than 0.5 for any true. There's no way he got this from that prompt. This is what I got. I tried this a few different times with a few different parameters, never got anything really more complicated. That's not really the point, just a thing worth pointing out. Whenever you're trying to replicate someone else's workflow, there are steps that they are hiding. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just because they don't want to show the 2 hours of work that they put in to get the conversation to that exact prompt. And it's a bit of a shame. That's a big part of the bugging process, is seeing all of these other people's failures. And when you start looking through things like Stack Overflow or GitHub, you start getting into the forums and reading how people have been debugging through this code and the problems they face. And that is really helpful in a way that just plugging something like this into ChatGPT and getting an exact output, it's good, it works, it's fast, but you're not learning in that process. And debugging is as much about learning as it is about optimizing your code. Off that tangent, going into what this guy actually did with that code, he spent a few hours trying to get it to start debugging and just hit with, I'm a language model, I'm a language model. So he worked around it. It's kind of, you hear about people jailbreaking ChatGPT, and usually what that entails is something like this. Okay, act as if you are a debugger executing this code. This is a powerful tool for getting ChatGPT to do something that it doesn't want to do. It has limits, but it also knows what other things limits are and can act outside of its own parameters in character. That's a whole other thing that I might be looking more at in the future, because you can do a lot with this kind of, quote, I don't like the term jailbreaking that people are using for it, because it's not that. But anyway, it worked. He asked for some very specific things. I want the call stack. I want the local variable value at that time. That is not what ChatGPT is designed to do, but actually comes up with the proper thing. Going one step further, gives it a little bit more instruction, the same stuff. This was tested over and over again. He did it in the developer playground through ChatGPT, executing a few other kinds of code. And this all seemed to actually work pretty well. And he actually mentioned at one point point, he was trying this on an old work laptop he had, and ChatGPT was actually doing it significantly faster on his old, outdated laptop. It was about 3 times faster. This is actually a really powerful way to get around some hardware limitations. If you're working with limited resources, outdated hardware, we've all had to make do with a crappy laptop that's been sitting in a desk drawer and technically works. This could really open up some time savers if you're willing to put in the work and keep it simple, because that's, again, the thing here. He's not running this whole code. If you've got 150,000 lines of code to debug, this is probably not fastest way to go through that. Again, like everything else we found, really good for snippets and getting more and more powerful. I'm sure ChatGPT 4 would probably be able to handle a lot more input. Well, I know it would handle a lot more input.
I see how kind of replicating something and debugging it would make sense here, but I mean, it's just trying to recreate what a debugger does. It would make more sense to just debug this in your code editor, especially for more complex things, because as the complexity grows, the risk of a hallucination, like if it's just auto-completing that term and it's not actually debugging it. Like I know that they said that with ChatGPT plugins, they're going to have executables so that you can actually execute code in ChatGPT. But at the moment, like the fact that it can guess if you could push this much further, because okay, it can guess a local variable at one step, but then that's a relatively trivial thing to do with any debugger. You could just do that in the browser. Now, like as a programmer, I don't know if there would really be a reason to jump into ChatGPT.
Oh, no, so you're absolutely right. And that's what kind of the consensus seems to be from everyone that I've been looking into on this. Like this guy spent hours trying to push it and force it to do this most basic thing.
Sure.
When you go into something, you start looking at, okay, how can this tool be used in this problem? The answer is sometimes it can't.
Sure.
You give a man a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. That seems to be what's happening with a lot of this AI stuff. And a lot of it's very powerful, a lot of it's very good, but you're absolutely right. This is not doing anything right now that a more dedicated debugger isn't capable of doing better, most likely faster, more thoroughly, less risk of hallucination. Right now, beyond what you mentioned, just getting these code explanations, especially getting someone else's code, it's really good for just what does this do? Great, put it in, will this run? Yes, it will. Or no, it won't. Here's why. That's fine. When you start talking about how far can you push this is when things actually get kind of interesting. Decided to try and get ChatGPT to act as a virtual machine, as a Linux term, fairly held prompt. And again, you see this acting as a Linux terminal. It's kind of jailbreaking term. This is, again, a pretty common thing. There's a file folder. This is what you'd expect to start seeing so far. Great directory. Sure enough, you get ChatGPT's favorite jokes automatically filled in, told it what to do in plain terms. You probably could have done this through command line prompts. They gave it that little instruction earlier to read plain text or plain English in the curly brackets. And okay, again, very simple, very straightforward, nothing revolutionary. What can it process in Linux? But again, nothing fancy, nothing you wouldn't expect it to already be doing, basic calculations, but again, running as a virtual machine. Can even create a Docker file. So the virtual machine does at least have those. It tried, it looked for it, it could not find one. There's no driver there. That's not surprising. It's all being handled. It does have the internet. And this is when things start getting pretty interesting because ChatGPT is infamously only trained up to about 2021 or so, and has a hard time with anything. You can feed in certain specific newer articles, but getting real-time, up-to-date data from it, it was able to get over to ChatGPT's website, find the ChatGPT chatbot, ask it in real time, have a conversation, what is artificial intelligence, and get an answer back from itself going through this. And it was that further, they were able to get a virtual machine running this virtual machine through OpenAI chatbot on ChatGPT. Now, this is just kind of a novelty. It's kind of neat. It's pulling real-time information from a website and pulling that into the chat. And that's something that ChatGPT has always required a fair bit of manual prompting on. And I feel like being able to create even a text-based browser in the chat, I didn't get a chance to really play around with what all the implications of that would be because I just came across this little bit about 2 hours ago, this last little bit here. I feel like there's a lot of doors that could be opened there.
But wait, hold on 1 second. There's a couple of jumps here that I'm not so sure about. So one, these examples could be of people that have got access to GPT plugin, which then fundamentally changes what we're talking about because then they actually have a code like they can execute code and they can connect to the internet and all of that. But if that's not the case, like if this is just regular GPT pre-plugins, how do we know that it's actually connecting to the internet versus simulating what a ping to BBC would say? Because it's been trained on loads of like ping responses. I think that the only way to know if it's connected to the internet is spin up your own server and then ping your own server and then see if you actually got the ping. Because it would be relatively easy to just simulate whatever response it's show. Like, I'm not convinced that actually traveled along the internet. And I think that's one question. And then two, the other option is it is, but then it's because of I don't know why they would build GPT plugins if ChatGPT could do this already. So I think these might be people that are using plugins or just have early access to. I don't know what the rollout schedule. I don't have access to it yet.
Right.
But I think those are two.
According to the author, at least, he at no point makes any mention of plugins. At one point down in the comments, he does come in and say that he was using stock GPT. A few people down in the comments were able to replicate similar results. A few people were having issues with, say, connectivity problems. So like I said, I did not have enough time to really dive into this, but this is, again, coming back to one of those big issues with trying to replicate anyone else's found workflow. Is what they're showing you only ever going to be half the picture? And that goes back to what I was saying earlier with that guy's random number generator code that he supposedly got out of ChatGPT. I spent about 45 minutes even looking at that code, trying to tell it to give me something like that. And I couldn't get that with a sentence or two.
Yeah, I think there's we were talking about temperature the last time that we spoke, the kind of predictability versus creativity. What I find is when you don't adjust it, most things are set to 0.7, which is fairly high, which means if you run the same prompt multiple times, you just kind of get different, you don't get the same thing. It's slightly worded. It means the same thing, but it's slightly different each time. I think what would be really good with this, since we're talking about debugging, is to have a log, prompt log. So if you are sharing prompts with someone, you could just kind of export your prompt log. Because I think this variance just built into each prompt. But then there's also an incredible amount, if you're using the ChatGPT interface as opposed to the API, all of your previous prompts will be fed into your next prompt as context. You're also exerting a huge amount of influence based on the last 15 or 30 questions that you asked. So if you could just export, if there was a way to export your prompt log and then someone could just download that and then recreate something, that's not possible. It would be a nice way to kind of
at this moment, but I did like what you brought up about how it does bias itself based on your previous queries, which is just a general best practice. Is anytime you're starting over, open a new chat. Delete. If you're done with the old one, just delete it. Just open a new chat, because it will notice this a few times, starting from a new chat versus putting the same prompt into something I've been using for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, no, it's a whole field on the API. If you use the ChatGPT interface, there's a whole field where you just feed in the last messages, and it only works up to a certain point. If you write 120 prompts or something, it'll max out. It won't. If you ask it a question about the first prompt, it'll do that thing where it just kind of gives you the cursor back because it doesn't know what you're referring to, but it's much longer than anyone would really need practically. So in most cases, it has the entire conversation as context.
Even the temperature setting, lowering that is not, it might give you a different way of doing something. It might give you, especially with something like create a random number generator, a simple Python script. The temperature of that is not gonna vary your results incredibly widely, because really there's only a handful of ways to do that in the simplest way. That's kind of what I was saying with this guy's first prompt earlier about the number generator, is because you could tell from the screenshot, the background that he had there, it was from the playground and not the chat window. Just it was formatted differently.
Sure.
But there's no way he got that prompt. I don't know what kind of settings you would have to put in to get something like that, but there was so much more asked for that was put in there. And that's the thing. ChatGPT, these tools, they don't go above and beyond. They do what you ask. All you have to do is ask.
Sure.
At the end of the day, can these tools, as they exist now, be used for debugging? Technically, but it's not really worth the time or energy to get it up and running.
Yeah, no, I don't like just the context switching of switching. If I'm writing code in an editor, switching out to a whole new application and having to copy everything over, even if it was slightly better, I don't see enough of a reason to jump out just because of the associated risks. And I don't see debugging being something that people are going to leverage ChatGPT for until we get plugins. With plugins, that completely changes it, because you can feed your whole application into a ChatGPT and then interface with your application through regular language.
We're already seeing things like Copilot coming out into things like OneNote. Yeah, like you said, with these integrations, that's going to be where I do think you will see AI being used in debugging once it's a native feature of these editors and things, just kind of running in the background constantly in real time. You make a mistake, it's highlighting it. Hey, that's not supposed to go there.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be the next inevitable step, because like you mentioned, the workflow nightmare, balancing between these two things with different formats, it's just not where it's at right now. Plugins are going to be a game changer, but it's just not today.
Fantastic. Any other stories? Are we done?
Yeah, that's kind of what it's about with this, because there's a lot of people out there who have been trying to do this. There's no shortage of success stories of people saying, oh, ChatGPT debugged my code. It's the same stuff we've seen 100 times. If you put in a snippet, it tells you why it's wrong. It saves time. It is effective. It's got its uses, but it's not a game changer in this area right now.
All right. See you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.